Thanks for joining us today. Hopefully you've had some time to read through our housekeeping notes on this slide. What I'd like to emphasize is that this event is meant to be interactive, so feel free to type your questions into the Q&A throughout the webinar. So who am I? I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Laura Gergley, Marketing Manager with McGraw-Hill Canada, specializing in science, engineering, math, and computers. So let's get started. Thanks for attending our webinar, How to Achieve Student Success in Your A&P Course. But why are we hosting this webinar? Well, before, during, and after COVID-19, we know that a lot of A&P instructors have always struggled with a few course challenges, including students coming to class underprepared, students having a hard time grasping difficult A&P concepts, and instructors finding it hard to bridge the gap between lab and lecture. So the question becomes, how do we achieve student success in the A&P course? So we hope that this webinar will help you solution some of these challenges today. So what are some of the outcomes we're looking to achieve today? Well, we actually have two. We want you to learn and hear from your A&P colleagues from across Canada. And secondly, most importantly, we want you to leave with best practices on how to achieve student success in your A&P course. So how are we going to achieve these outcomes? Well, let's go over today's agenda. First up, we're going to lead with innovative ways to achieve student success in your A&P course. Bill will discuss his best practices, teaching tips and tricks, while demoing Connect for A&P to help bridge the gap between lab and lecture. And then we're going to wrap up with a quick Q&A. So before I pass this off to Bill, let me introduce him. Dr. Bill Hoover is the Chair of Anatomy and Physiology at Bunker Hill Community College in Boston. For the past 7 years, he's conducted digital pedagogical research under a nationally funded STEM grant. His research focuses on how students learn and how faculty effectively teach with emerging digital tools. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Bill Hoover. Bill, over to you.
Great, thank you, Laura, and thank you everyone from Canada who's attending the session today. As Laura mentioned, we want this to be extremely interactive, so at any point in time, just interject your questions. Laura will be fielding them, and she will, kindly interject with me and ask me to address them. So that's the best way we can get things done, because if you wait till the very end, sometimes you may have forgotten or we just never get to them. So please feel free to ask anytime. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and I have a small PowerPoint presentation for you to share exactly what I've been doing for the last couple of years. But to let you know, as the chair, I have about 40 adjuncts below me who during the pandemic obviously needed to acclimate from print to digital. So the challenges, were immense. I mean, bringing everyone up to speed over spring break, because I think today is 1 year, isn't it? Whenever the country basically shut down. So fortunately, we had at least 1 week, not a lot of time, but we had a week to be able to identify all of our challenges and try to make sure that we could train our faculty to be able to use digital tools, but then to also train them to teach with them so that their students would receive a really solid education. So it's been a growing experience. We'll share some of the wins and some of the losses as well, and how we learned from those losses and made our courses better. So I think most of you, if you've been communicating via Zoom like we are today, you can probably appreciate this slide and know what it feels like at the end of the day, and imagine our students being the same way, and our kids, that are in school, learning via Zoom. So what were some of the lessons that we learned, as we tackled this new normal, for teaching, courses online in this digital environment? So what we learned is that we needed to have assignable, interactive digital learning materials, and some of the things that come along with that I guess, we didn't find out until later, were accessibility, 508 compliance, ADA compliance, were our students who had disabilities able to access the same learning materials that, everyone else did? Was the content, quality assured, making sure that there weren't errors. And if there were, did they get fixed? We also understood that we had to provide learning outcomes for, all of our courses from a digital perspective. And then we had to align those outcomes to our presentation materials, to our formative assessments, which I like to describe as homework, and then also to our summative assessments, which are more like your quizzes and your exams. We have an organization called Quality Matters that provides that guidance in terms of the way that we should align those learning outcomes to presentation materials. And then the homework should come right from those presentation materials. And then the quizzes and exams should also follow those learning outcomes so that the students, are being assessed fairly. And then last, we have, virtual lab activities. So for those of you who are teaching, in a hybrid environment, you may still be meeting on campus. Some of our courses are, like our physics and chemistry, but our anatomy and physiology converted to completely online. So once again, we needed those virtual lab activities to have all of that compliance built in, before we were able to launch them. So I challenged my educators and said, let's become a game changer. The world already has enough players. Let's change the game. Let's rise to this, challenge and make sure that we not only meet it, but we exceed it. So one of the first things that we discovered, and again, this is coming from an initial loss, was that we assigned a lot of digital activities, not, necessarily thinking about how much our students were going to need in the way of guidance, in using these digital tools. I mean, they can use things like Twitter and, Facebook and, social media, Snapchat. But when we're talking about some of the tools that they have to use to complete their work through an LMS, or through publisher generated content, they absolutely positively needed to have some instruction, and so then here are some of our takeaways. We wanted to make the technology move to the background. Why? Because we knew that every time we had a synchronous lecture, a live lecture, we would spend at least half of our time, trying to walk the students through, how to complete their assignments, online. And so we never really got to the content. We wanted to show students the pitfalls and how to avoid them. Sometimes there was a requirement that says that you can't move on. Let's say if you're watching a video, you have to watch it all the way till the very end before you can move to the next assignment. And that for us, we wanted to make sure that they were getting all of the information that we were serving up. And so, if they didn't know that and they kept trying to advance, they couldn't do it. So then they would send us emails. We also wanted to provide the tips and tricks, so sometimes in a homework assignment, as you're going to see today, and if some of you have accessed the reverse class test, which I think everyone has had made available to them with a supercode that you could go in and access the course, you'll see that there are student self-helps, like Check My Work, where they can hover over a drop zone and it will give them a hint, or a reference back to the ebook. So we wanted to be able to provide that in those how-to videos so that they could use the tools more effectively and perform better. And then showing the step-by-step, especially for things like a virtual lab. There might be 25 to 30 different steps that they have to walk through, and they may have to access a digital journal, after they've completed something like a pulmonary function test, and then enter that data. Right. And so to be able to show them, especially if it was mobile ready, and some things like you have to tap and then tap where you want it to drop. You can't just tap your finger and slide it. So there were all of these little tiny details that we included now in our how-to videos so that students watch those first and then they attempt the activities. And you will see what I think is the most important to us is to keep our email boxes empty for all of those technology-based questions. And again, we're going to walk through those so you'll get to see exactly how helpful those tools are. So the first thing that I wanted to start with today that I think everyone can relate to is reading assignment. How do you get students to read before they come to class? So traditionally we would say, I want you
Who even is that?
I don't know, but he put her risk up.
Why aren't these connecting?
what we call SmartBook 2.0, okay? And let's take a look at, what our typical student looks like now. And we're close enough right across the border here that I think our students are, very similar to yours. The average age for a student now, because of the retransitioning, especially due to the pandemic, is 27 years old, right? 64% are working, at least a full or part-time job. Many of them, 28%, have children. And 28% of the students struggle to balance all of these obligations and then to try and fit school in there somewhere, right? And 40% of college students in two-year institutions report having trouble providing food for them and their families. So we have a much different demographic than maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So I wanted to just give you an example of one Gen Z learner. She's 30 years old, a new mom, she works full times, and she's trying to, achieve a degree so that she can provide better for her family. Now, what would you say is, the characteristics about the SmartBook 2.0, right? We say that, she has very unique needs, right? So she needs to know what to focus on because her time is very, very valuable. So we need to be able to provide her a way to, hit those learning outcomes with the specific reading assignment that we give to her. We need to be able to provide her built-in learning resources, and that's what SmartBook 2.0 does. And when you see it, you'll be pretty amazed. There's an actionable dashboard that if she's struggling somewhere, she can be remediated back to the book. She can be remediated to other learning resources. Let's say a tutorial that has been created by a subject matter expert like yourself that is giving these tips and tricks, of how to learn the material. Because if we think about it, these textbooks are written by PhDs, peer reviewed by PhDs, but then it's being read by our students who sometimes might not have more than an 8th or 9th grade learning level, okay? And then lastly, what SmartBook provides her is a recharge. We built this particular product based on Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve, which basically says that if you learn something today, in 1 month, you will probably forget about 85% of it if you do not review that material. So the recharge isn't just covering everything from, A to Z again. The recharge, is very selective in the content that it serves up to the student. So it won't serve up things that the student, showed competency very, very quickly on, because that would be wasting their time. It actually finds those concepts where they struggled, those learning outcomes that they had a difficult time understanding, and they will serve that content up first to make sure that they have no learning gaps as they move on to higher ordered thinking questions and content. So what is unique about, let's say, the particular assignment? And this is what I think was just like a game changer for me and my students. I have students from 150 different countries. Some of them are, struggling financially, especially during the pandemic. They have to make choices between feeding their families and maybe having Wi-Fi in their house so that they can complete their assignments. And they used to be able to go to places like Dunkin' Donuts or, a public library where they could access the Wi-Fi there. But that has all been turned on its head. So they haven't had good, consistent access to Wi-Fi. So what we're going to find here is that there is an app and it's free. Okay. And what this app does is it allows the student to download not only chapters of content, but also the homework reading assignments that accompany it. Okay. And whenever they download that, they can work offline so that they don't have to have any type of Wi-Fi. And then they work on their phones, they complete it. And then all they have to do for 5 minutes, is just walk back to wherever they had the Wi-Fi originally and sync it. one click of a button, it syncs up to the cloud, and then it goes into your grade book and shows that they've completed their work. Now, you might not think that that's a big deal, but imagine that you have 2 kids at home and they have schedules and you have to help them with their work and you can't leave your house to go somewhere to get access to Wi-Fi. What are you going to do? How are you going to get your work done after they go to bed or before they wake up in the morning? This provides them the ability to work on that assignment offline and still earn their credit, even though they may not be able to afford Wi-Fi. Okay. So the other thing is that a lot of public transportation provides Wi-Fi access. So if he or she's commuting, back and forth to work or to wherever, they have the ability to do their work right on their phone and use that 40 to 50 minutes sometimes, wisely and be able to work on their assignments while they are, commuting back and forth. So we say, students typically don't always know exactly where they need extra help, right? So if they're struggling, how do they know what they're going to do? I'm going to give you just a quick little background of some research that I did. We put the Oculus headsets on students and we asked them to read 2 pages worth of material. And we asked them to read that same 2 pages 3 times. And we were able to track their eyes as they were reading each and every line of the content. And what we noticed, the first time that they read every single sentence. But the second time they read, they were skipping little pieces or, sentences. And the third time they skipped the exact same sentences. Okay, so keep that in mind, because then we asked them and we said, we're going to give you a small quiz, 10 questions. And we want to know what your perception is of how well you're going to do on this quiz. And every single one of them said, I've read this thing 3 times. I know it like the back of my hand. I'm going to get every one of these questions right. But whenever we, graded their assessments, we found that the average was about 70%, 7 out of 10 questions, and they couldn't believe it. And so whenever we tried to research and find out why, we noticed that the exact material that they missed was actually found in the areas that they skipped for 2 times in a row, the last 2 times that they read. And so we asked the students, we said, the first time you read everything, but the second time you were skipping almost the exact same pieces of information. Why did you do that? And they said, well, because we didn't really understand it. It didn't make sense. So we just moved on. So there lies, the rub. They honestly and truly knew what they knew, right? So whenever they read the stuff that made sense to them, they crushed it and they got all of those questions correct. But whenever they got to the material that they didn't understand, they skipped it, not realizing that that would show up on their exam, right? Meaning that their performance or their lack of knowledge would show up. So what SmartBook does is it grabs that information and pushes them out of their comfort zone to make sure that they review it, provide them the remediation that they need, so that whenever it comes time for that, summative assessment, their quiz or their exams, they have a good understanding of that material. Okay. So this is that app. And so for me, one thing that I've learned, during this digital revolution, for teaching online, is that everybody's got something that they want to push into your face and say, you should use this because, right? Well, I basically want to have some evidence or proof that my time is not going to be wasted, right? So number one, I want to make sure that if it is an app-based product, that it is for both Android and iPhones, right? I want to make sure that it has been used a lot, right? That this isn't something that I'm a guinea pig using for the first time, but you'll see that 10 billion of these questions have been, served up and answered by students where data has been collected. There's a heat map behind the content that if students across the country and across the globe keep missing questions of certain based on certain learning outcomes, that information is sent back to people like me who author in this tool. And we say, okay, there's something wrong here. We need to make this information easier for the students to grasp, to comprehend, and to be able to apply the information. So that's where the remediation comes whenever we serve up different tools to explain the same type of information. I mean, students do it naturally. They go to YouTube, they go to Wikipedia, they'll do Google searches. But what we want to do is to say, let's push them in the right direction, but let's make sure that this content is vetted by subject matter experts like yourselves. I also wanted to make sure that whenever we're using something that it's across discipline, right? Because if I'm a student and I have to go in and learn how to use a different piece of technology for microbiology, for nutrition, for A&P, for general bio, for non-majors bio, I mean, that becomes a nightmare. And I spend more time, focusing on the technology than I do the actual content and learning. And then, whenever we're talking about accessibility standards, that became very important to us because we fortunately didn't get sued, but we had a couple of students who, pushed back a lot and said, how come we can't access, the same content that everyone else, can access? We want to be able to have the same chance at, success in these courses. And so that's why it became very important for us to make sure that right off the bat, we ask the right questions and make sure that, content that's going to be delivered is accessible, right? And then, of course, just like any good review on Yelp or anywhere else, we wanted to make sure that their rating was good. So let's take a look, just very quickly at what this looks like. So you can download that textbook and the assignment from anywhere, and the students, once again, can complete it offline. The really cool thing, too, is that if students want to highlight a piece of material, they can do that. If they want to put in a sticky note as a reminder, they can do that. And all of that, too, syncs up to the cloud, not just their homework. So this is basically what it looks like whenever they access the chapter or the textbook. They'll see all the chapters listed here, and they know that they're in the cloud. And if they want them, they can download them. That's what that little downward arrow represents. And so they can download 3 to 5 chapters at a time so that they can work on those, without having to get back to, Wi-Fi. And everything is being saved and everything will sync whenever they're done. So here's an example of them, highlighting material that they think is important and that they want to recall or go back and review. And once again, remember that this too syncs to the cloud whenever they get back to the Wi-Fi. There's only one caveat. Remember, I said I'm not just going to tell you all the goods. I'm going to tell you some of the, the drawbacks as well. I mean, technology is fantastic, and everything that you've heard so far probably sounds really good. But as an educator, you have to know that if you have a due date, right? Students sometimes don't think about this needing to be synced to the cloud. So if the due date, let's say, is today and they've finished it on their phone, but they don't get to Wi-Fi tomorrow and they tap to sync it, well, then it appears that their work is late. So number one, make sure that your students know that. And number two, I try to be a little more lenient, about the due date and to give them extensions if that's the case. So again, this provides, more freedom to the student, more affordable in the sense that they don't have to buy that physical textbook if they don't prefer it. They're more prepared and they have those aha moments whenever they get that remediation that accompanies it. Okay. So what I'd like to do, I try to divide this into bite-sized chunks. So I'll stop here for now and see if anyone has any questions. Laura, did anyone put anything in the chat, or is there anyone who would like to ask a question now before I actually demo the product live?
I haven't seen anything come up yet, but it's a great time to pause. So if anyone in the audience does have any questions, feel free to shoot Bill a line.
Yeah. And I'm basically going to access the reverse class test. And if you're not familiar with the reverse class test, basically what it is it allows you as an educator to have a little sampling, almost like if you've been to Napa Valley and you've done the little wine tastings, or, you go to, well, we used to be able to do, in a place like Cabot, where they make cheeses, you can go in and take a little sampling. Well, this is what this reverse class test is. And I've created this specially for your group and your group only. And I have included, let's say, a document here that will allow you to go in and see the different question types. Because again, if I don't understand, why a certain question type was built, meaning if it is a classification, composition, labeling, and when best to use it and how it should be used, then I'm not going to be effective as an educator. So I included that document here for you to download and take a look at. And then after you've had a chance to read that, you're going to see one example of all of the different question types here, right? Again, this isn't like a big, long homework assignment. It's one labeling question, maybe two, right? But you'll get to experience it like the students would. You will get to see what the self-help features are like, meaning, where do I go to access the textbook that's covering that material? How do I check my work and then go back and fix any of the mistakes that I have made, for these formative based assignments. So, this gives you a really, really good taste, of what each of these activities that are available to you and for you to assign to your student, you get a chance to experience them, right? So here I have the, well, I need to change these due dates. So that way, if you are accessing them now, you can have access to them. Because I think this gives you, I think you have a 2-week access free, to be able to experience this as a student. And if you need more time, by all means, let me know. I'll just copy the course to you, which is very simple. And it'll show up in your Connect account. If you don't have one, I think Laura can definitely make sure that you get one. But that way you'll be able to give it a good test run and see what this digital learning is all about. So again, what we've covered so far is the SmartBook reading assignment, right? So I'm going to go into the student view. And just like I said, I can copy this whole course to you very easily by clicking on here, copy, right? So if I wanted the whole course to be copied to you, I would come here, copy this section to a colleague. You would become my colleague. I would copy it. Laura would provide me your email addresses, to access Connect. I would enter them here and it would instantly, this whole course would be instantly put into your Connect account. And then you could do what I'm doing right now, which is try it as a student would try it. Okay. So whenever the student comes in to this SmartBook reading assignment, the first thing I want you to see, and that I think is really, really beneficial and helpful, especially if you're making decisions about digital learning, is this is a mobile ready platform, which means that it works with Android, it works with iOS, and it has what we call responsive technology. So right now I'm on a laptop, but if I was on a big iMac, everything would move around to accommodate the bigger screen real estate and make it easier for me to navigate and move around, on the screen. And the same in reverse. If I came down to a cell phone, I would see that that particular screen would then adapt. We call it responsive technology, so that then we could use pinch technologies, we could use swipe, we could use tap. And so we know that students will be able to be successful whenever they're using their phones. So that's number one. Make sure that it is a mobile ready platform, that you're using. So here we are. Number one, here's that tutorial that I was telling you about. So once again, this tutorial is going to provide the students with all of the information that they need to be able to navigate this particular assignment. And you notice that it's assignable and it's worth points. So guess what? If a student says, that stupid SmartBook, it's not working, I don't understand why, this is what I hate about technology. Well, you could go in and see if they've even watched the tutorial, right? That's always my first place, is just to ask the student, did you watch it? And then I trust but verify. I go into my gradebook to see if they've actually watched it, but you'll see that they have, a question down below just to basically say that they've completed it. But they have this available to them, constantly. They do not have to go back and forth, or they do not have to be without this type of tutorial whenever they come back to another reading assignment for the next chapter.
Bill, we did get a question come in from Dave
Yes.
Cato, and he said, I guess he's just wanting to reinforce that students can access this only if they have access to the Connect program or
Correct.
product.
So,
Yeah,
so the
that's
way,
correct.
yes. So the way that it would work is if you as the instructor created your course, or if you take me up on my offer, which I haven't mentioned yet, but I am offering the course that I've created as a template for you that you can go in and just tweak. You know, you can hide assignments that you don't want to use. You can delete questions that you don't like or don't feel cover the learning outcomes that you want. But let's say the overall infrastructure is already built. I'm willing to copy that to you. So if you then deploy a course, whether it's mine or one you build from scratch, the students would then be given, you know, a URL or access through their LMS to be able to access the assignments. And whenever they access the assignments, they then have the right to download the app. And when at the time that they download the app from the App Store, you know, it will ask for their login credential, you know. And if you have single sign-on for your LMS, you know, with Connect, which I think most of you do, then they would instantly just enter their user ID and password that they use to get into their LMS, and it would recognize that they have a license and they would be able to access it instantly. If that doesn't answer your question, make sure you let me know, because I want to make sure that everybody's clear on, you know, this platform, what it does do and what it can't do. Okay. So again, I have that, you know, I have that tutorial, and then whenever, so I need to exit this, when the student now has watched it and they say, okay, I think I got it. The nice thing with this smart book is that it's pretty streamlined. We did a lot of student and faculty focus groups to make sure that it wasn't too cumbersome, that there weren't too many clicks that were being used. And we also wanted to provide the student just a little overview, right? So right now it tells them the pertinent things. When is it due? Approximately how long will it take me to finish the entire assignment? How many concepts or learning outcomes am I expected to address whenever I do this? And then they have two choices. Some students love to, they love to have their, you know, physical book open. And so while they're going through the assignment to get their points, they have to answer the questions. So they'll hold open their book, they'll click on start with questions. I typically say that's not the best way, but it can be done that way. I say, you know, to my students, and again, this is in the tutorial, I say, you know, read first, right, before you answer questions. And in the reading, you're going to find that you have a few tips and tricks to your, you know, at your disposal. You know, so up here are the concepts. And as they go through the learning outcomes, what you're going to notice is that each of the learning outcomes that were identified by you as the educator as being really important and that they can't move on without grasping these concepts, they're all going to be highlighted, pre-highlighted for them based on your choice of information that you felt was most important. Again, you get to choose that, not me, not anyone else. You get to choose it. And then your students say, oh boy, this is really cool, because for the first time in my life, someone is telling me within a 75 pages of material what is most important and where I should focus my time. So they move on to each of these highlighted areas. And the other thing that's really nice is that all of the probes or the questions that they have to answer to get credit are definitely going to come from this highlighted material. So once again, I share this with my students to encourage them to read, right? Because if they say, well, if I need to get all my points, you know, to be successful in this course, then I know that all the questions are coming from it, then I'm definitely going to read it. Right, I'm going to take the time, you know, to read it, and you'll see that it's skipping some content. And the reason it does that is that it's based on Bloom's taxonomy of learning. You know, the first level of learning is just simple memorization. So if you ask them, what is the definition of diffusion? The movement of a substance from an area of high concentration to low concentration. They got it, but does that mean they can apply it? Absolutely not. They need to understand it first. So you might put sugar in a semi-permeable membrane, tie off the top, drop it down into pure water, right? And then watch, you know, the water move into the semi-permeable membrane and cause it to swell. So then they see that water is moving from an area of high concentration, meaning pure water, into the membrane sac, you know, that had a low concentration of water. So then they get to apply that later whenever you say, okay, now that we're covering the respiratory system, whenever you breathe in air, you have more oxygen in the air than you do in your bloodstream. So it's going to diffuse across the membrane into the blood. So basically what we're saying here is that all of these learning outcomes are going to be stacked on top of each other so that the reading will match the level of understanding that's required for each level of Bloom's as they go through the assignment. And I'll pause there for just a second because that concept, is based on learning science. How do people learn information? And if we start with Bloom's level 1, which is the memorization, and we lay a good foundation, whatever we build on top of it will be supported by that information and not have learning gaps that we can fall through, as a student. So,
Dave did actually have another follow-up question, and I think this still applies to sort of the SMART book.
absolutely.
So do these need to be assigned? So I guess assignments, do these need to be assigned by me, or can they access the Learn Smart like we used to? So adaptive, yeah.
It's exactly like the old Learn Smart. So for those of you who have used Learn Smart before, it just has a new name called Smart Book. But I think what you're going to love, and I'll show you how to do it, you can go in and create that granularity very similar to the way the old Learn Smart, was assigned or set up. But it has much more granularity, and it's really cool in the sense that now you can do multiple chapters at the same time. Let's say if you're going to give an exam, so you have 2 different ways of deploying content. You can do one chapter in the old Learn Smart way, where you have chapter, section, and then subsections. But now we've taken it all the way down to the level of a concept inside of a learning outcome. So you might have diffusion, understanding diffusion as the learning outcome, but then underneath you might have concepts like, how does partial pressure affect diffusion? Or how does surface area affect diffusion, or understand how surface area affects diffusion? So those subcategories will let you get all the way down to the very granular level. So you assign it almost identical to the way that you used it before, but just imagine it it's on steroids now in terms of the way that you can, assign and deploy it. Okay. So once the student has completed the reading, right, they've gone through all the way to the end of the chapter by reading these concepts, then they'll say, okay, I think I'm ready to start answering some questions to get my points. And whenever they do, once again, they're given a little reminder, make progress by completing the concepts. It's okay to get something wrong. Remember, this is a formative assessment. It's a safe place to make mistakes and fail, right? We call it productive failure. Right? Productive failure. If they fail, we remediate them. We show them, where they made their mistakes so that they can grasp the concept and be able to fill in that learning gap. Right? And then it says to submit your answers by selecting your confidence level. And again, this confidence level gives us a plethora of information. Not only does it tell the heating map where we need to spend more time building new resources, it will also identify with that one particular student, and then for you as an educator, the whole class, which concepts they struggled with the most. Which means that if you want, at the beginning of every class, you can run that report from that actionable dashboard and see that you have, all my calendars are popping up. You can see exactly which content that you need to spend time covering with your students. Once again, the students love this because they say, wow, how is it possible that my teacher is able to identify all of the things that we as a class struggled with, and then actually took the time to make sure that we understood it before he moved on or she moved on, right? That's a pretty cool thing, and students really, really appreciate that. So I want to point out a couple of things. One is that you're going to have several different types of questions. We thought in our faculty focus groups, it was really important to not just give multiple choice, true, false, and fill in the blank. We wanted select all that apply. We have drag and drops for things like labeling. We have classification questions built in here where you might say, there's a word library at the top that might say, my goodness, I don't know how to turn that off. It comes back on. But you might say increases blood pressure, decreases blood pressure are the 2 bins that you're going to drop these things in, and you might have sympathetic activity, parasympathetic activity. You might have person has taken cocaine, person has taken barbiturates, and they would have to drag them and drop them. That's a classification. But there are about 12 to 15 different question types again, so that students aren't just memorizing, what they're seeing on the screen. They're actually having to think about it from like 4 or 5 different, directions. So whenever the student says, identify the 5 major categories of infectious agents, now, once again, they may get some of them, right? If they just say bacteria, viruses, and fungi, and they say, well, I think I know it, and they hit medium, they realize, oh boy, I made a few mistakes here. I should have included, the other 2. So then they move on to their next question, and you notice that they didn't get credit for learning that material. Okay, it's only whenever they get the answers right. And here's another one, fill in the blank. 3 types of granulocytes are eosinophils, basophils, and right. And so they say, oh, I think I really know this, and they got it correct. What I want to tell you too is that there is what we call tolerance built into this, so that even if they spell it incorrectly, they'll still get credit, but they'll be reminded of the correct spelling. Right. Again, this is formative, not summative. So it's, once again, a great place to make mistakes. What I want to show you now is that, if they miss, several in a row, right, and they go to the next question, and innate immunity, we'll say, we'll miss it because I want to show you what happens. This is what I really love, is that once a student has missed questions of the same topic too many times, it's basically saying, before you move on, you must review a resource for this question, which means that they actually have to be remediated so that they don't fall into that same learning gap again, right? So they click on it and they come down here and it says select, a resource. In this case, it takes them back to the book, and it's going to talk about innate immunity, right? So that the student reads it, and once they've read it, they can go back to the questions and continue. So this is a great way to make sure that students aren't just, skimming over the material just to complete the assignment and never really learning from it. Okay. Any questions about how a student progresses through and then eventually completes all of the concepts before they're able to move on and receive full credit?
Bill, I wanted to just step in here.
Yeah.
Hopefully other audience members have some questions about the question you just asked, but Dave said that he loves the granularity. He thinks it's much more focused, a much more focused learning experience for the students as it meets the learning objectives. He also said he just downloaded the smartphone, or downloaded the app on smartphone and iPad, and it works quite well.
Great.
And he's saying thanks for all the feedback you're providing him too. So,
Absolutely.
So Dave, if you have any other questions at this point, as well as other audience members, please feel free to type them in the Q&A there. Oh, We've got one from Sarah.
All right, Sarah.
All right, so Sarah's asking, do the students get exactly the same smart book assignment based on what the instructor makes, or is it individualized for each student?
It is based on what the instructor assigns. However, their path through the material is different, which means that some students might be strong in one particular area. So like what we were just discussing about the immune system, some of them might understand innate immunity versus adaptive immunity. So if they are going through the innate immunity type questions and they're answering them very consistently and correctly, then they will progress quicker through that information. However, if they're struggling through the adaptive portion, then what happens is whenever they answer a question at a certain Bloom's level, if they don't understand it, they'll be backed down to the content and the Bloom's level questions at the next lower level. And if they don't understand it there, they'll be back down yet one more time down to Bloom's level 1. And basically what it's doing is saying, okay, let's just pretend it's the real world and they were in your office and you said, it's chapter 3, we're covering the cells. And you said, well, what do you know? Or what are you having troubles with? And they said, everything, right? Well, that doesn't really help. So what you might say is, do you understand the cell and that it has organelles? And they said, well, what are organelles, right? And you said, well, they're little mini organs, and one is a mitochondria. And you say, do you know what, mitochondria does? And they say, no. Each time you're backing down your level of content that you're trying to introduce to them. And that's exactly what the program does. So for everybody, that's going to be different. And that's why we call it adaptive. Okay. That's why we call it adaptive. And what Dave was saying, so I can quickly, show you how granular this gets, we're going to open up the SmartBook assignment. Now, remember, if you take me up on my offer, I already have these assignments pre-made, so you won't have to go through all of these steps. The only thing you'll have to do is go in and edit, right? Which means to select or deselect the content that you feel is important or not important. Okay.
Yeah, if I could jump in there, Bill has kindly created for this webinar his gold standard courses. So again, it's pre-populated with all of this really great content for your A&P courses. So if you do want access to that, feel free to email me. And like Bill said, we can just, within a few clicks, just copy it right over into your own Instructor or Connect Instructor account.
Yep. And the way I like to describe that, and I did to my adjuncts, was you can create something from the ground up, which means that how many of you like buying a bike from the store for your children that needs to be completely assembled from the ground up? Probably not too many of you. Maybe there's some mechanics in there, but most of you would like to go to the back, point to the one that you want. They bring it up to the front and you can take it home already put together. Now, it's not to say that you might not want to change the tires, put, a horn or a light or, other things on the bike, maybe change the seat type, but you don't have to build it from the ground up. And that's what I'm offering, is that, you'll be able to modify it in any way that you see fit, but you won't have to go through, the whole process of building it from the ground up. So this is what I think, Dave, you recognize as being normal. Here you have the chapter, and then you have the subsections, right? And so whenever we go to a subsection, you're going to see that you'll see these subsections here, but now we have the granularity of all of these little concepts inside of this one subsection of the chapter. So again, when this becomes really important is, let's say you want to build this assignment for an exam. You can say, well, there's a lot of fluff in this chapter that I already expect students to know. So I'm not going to ask them questions that surround definitions because that's too easy. I'm going to go in and, focus on things that are more, let's say, more critical thinking types. So maybe you would deselect, several of these, right, and leave those blank, but, focus on these, right? So this gives you much more granularity. And what this really does for your student is to say, I don't want you to waste your time. I don't think it's important for you to memorize every single word in the 75-page chapter. I want you to focus more on the concepts that I feel are going to help you whenever you move on to the next course, or the next discipline that uses this material, right? So you can either do it very granularly like that, or you still have the old-fashioned slide bar, Dave, that I'm sure you remember, is that you can assign everything. And let's say you bring it all the way down to about, let's say we'll bring it down to here. My goodness. We bring it down here and we say that, 43 to 65 minutes, right? But you see how much material is not being covered now. So what we're saying whenever we just slide this bar is that we are covering the material from a broad perspective, but very shallow, okay? And that might be what I do is I create those just for like the pre-lectures, so pre-lecture reading. So that way they know just enough to be dangerous, but they do come to class with a general understanding. And then I take them for a deeper dive whenever we go through our synchronous lectures, okay? But again, if you wanted to assign it more granularly for something like a quiz or an exam, then you could create, one where you actually go through each and every single one of these, not only chapters, but sections and then subsections, and then underneath the subsections, the individual pieces of content that apply to that subsection. So again, I just wanted to show you that that's how granular you can get. But again, you don't have to do all of this, on your own. This isn't something that you have to do from the ground up, just like that bike, you can buy it already pre-assembled and then modify it any way that you want. You won't have to, put the tires on the frame and the handlebars on, and you won't have to do any of that.
Bill, I think Sarah here, she asked, so she's actively using Coles' Essentials textbook. She's asking, does Bill have a pre-populated Connect assignments made for that textbook?
I certainly do. And actually, if you have enough time, the new version of Holes is coming out the first week of April. And I've already created most of the assignments with the labs in there for the new version. So I don't know which version you're going to use. I think it's 15 or 16. 15, I think, is the old version. 16 is the new one. But if you're going to use the older one, I can copy that to you today. If you are going to use the new version starting in the fall or the summer, then if you can hold on until the first week of April, you'll have all of the brand new assignments, which they have some really good applied anatomy type activities in there. This is one good thing about having me today, is that I've been an author for McGraw-Hill. I was actually the first digital author for them. So I know all of the different learning assets when they're coming out. I've helped develop them. So if there's ever any type of a question or, a way that you might want to use it, you have one of the best resources here, because I really do care about learning. I really do care about teaching, and I push McGraw-Hill to the outer edges of the earth to make sure that those things are getting done. So Sarah, just let me know. I can give you I have no problem with giving you the current course, and then also copying you the new edition course afterwards. So if you want both, just simply put that in the chat, and I'll be happy to do that, once the session's over today.
Sarah said, excellent, thank you. It's always nice to see how the other instructors set up their assignments, which is very true.
Absolutely.
I have only ever pulled from the question bank for assignment questions. So again, Bill's gold standard course has a wide variety of learning assignments and applications. So you can use more than just the question banks, and you can get a flavor. So Sarah, feel free to reach out to me or Bill after this, and let us know which one you'd like to experience, whether it's the current or new edition, and we can set you up with that course.
Yep. And you'll notice whenever I send you guys the course, there's going to be more than what you need, meaning if there is a particular lab, right? So right here, I've showed you just one Phil's lab and one virtual lab, but I will have a dissection lab. I will have these two different physiology-based labs, but there's also, I include, let's say, EKGs, following exercise, EKGs, at rest. I give you all of the labs, and then you can decide which ones you want to deploy. But once again, you won't have to actually go through the process of searching for them, finding them. All you can do is say, you know what, I like these two labs, but I don't want the virtual lab. I just want the Phil's lab. All you have to do is hide it, and then your students will never see it, right? But you may want to use it down the road. So it's always there for you to have, but you won't have to create them from the ground up, which is the great thing about these.
Just a nice little plug here. Sarah says she loves the virtual labs. Some feedback, which is cool. I know that you're going to get to that in a bit, Bill.
Yes.
And then Dave has another question. One of the questions I have always had in the years of Learn Smart. Will there, or is there an opportunity to add your own questions to the product?
That's a very good question. And unfortunately, in all of the research that we've done, Dave, is that it's hard for us to permit the addition of new questions. And one of that comes down to quality assurance, which means that we have to stand behind our product, and me as an author, I need to stand behind, what I've created. And, if questions are interjected, and sometimes the intention for the question as well, but it is not as accurate as need be or could be, it presents a challenge. And so what we've done in lieu of that is to send this out to subject matter experts, just like we did, let's say, a physical book. And we've asked you, let's say, to, pick a chapter that you would love to review, tell us if you think it's accurate, not accurate, what types of information needs to be added. If there's a clinical scenario that, that could be added that, applies some critical thinking, or clinical application, so we ask for, feedback that way in terms of modification, because there is a huge mind map, that if I showed it to you for one chapter, it would cover all 4 walls, of your house, or, of your room. That shows if you know this, then you need to know that. And if you need this, then you need to know that. And so all of those are very thoughtfully put into place. And that's how the probes or the questions are tied to that mind map. So unfortunately, no. But if you do want to create homework assignments, which I'm about to show you now, that's where you can add questions, to your activities very, very easily. So I want to just rapidly show you each of these question types. And again, these are all interactive, and I can access them here as a student would see them. And this would be a labeling question. And again, this is in that reverse class test for you guys to just, get a taste or a sampling. And so what I want you to see here is that, there's a word bank over here, and lots of times there are more words than there are, drop zones, for the student. So instead of them just shuffling, until they get them all in the right place and quote unquote earn their points, they actually have to know something. They can't do that anymore. So I'll show you quickly. Obviously, if they want a hint, right, we'll do this. And you'll notice that whenever I hover, oh my goodness, I think everybody knows she has a skating lesson today now. Whenever they hover, you're going to see the hint. It says, this is one of the nodes located in the armpit. So if they recall that axillary and armpit, basically mean the same thing, then they can say, oh yeah, I remember that. That's a great hint. And the reason why we provide those hints is not to make it easier. Learning science says is that if we take a abstract, word, right? Because we say text is abstract. And then whenever we see that leader line pointing to the axillary region, showing these little nodes, those are images and those are concrete. So now those two things get married in the student's mind, so that down the road, whenever they see an axillary node show up in a piece of, passage of content, in their mind, instantly they see armpit and they see these little green nodes that are draining lymphatic fluids, right? So that is why we marry the content with the images, because not only does it make it easier for students to understand and learn, it actually makes it easier to be put or imprinted into long-term memory. Okay, so that's the hint. But then, students, they're just basically going to say, oh, I just got to get through this assignment. And so what do? They just drag and drop a bunch of things in place. They think they're going to be able to use the check my work and get a leg up and finish this thing quickly. So they say, check my work. And then whenever they do, they realize, holy smokes, I only have 2 right and I have 5 wrong. So what does this accomplish? It basically says to the student, whenever they return, oh my goodness, I only have 1 chance to check my work left. What happens if I just shuffle them again? I'm probably not going to get all of my points, right? So this forces what we call active learning. They have to come to the ebook and they have to click on the section, not the exact page often, but the section of the book that is going to cover this particular topic and this particular figure in the book. So students love this feature. Why? Because it gets them to, almost where they need to be very, very quickly. And you might say, well, why don't you just show them the picture? Well, because they actually might pick up a few things, as they're scrolling down trying to find it. But now they can look at it and say, okay, here's the cervical lymph nodes. Oh yeah, that makes sense because it's the cervical vertebrae up here. Axillary, yep, that's armpit. Oh, this thing hanging over top of the heart, that's the thymus. Oh, and the spleen's on the left side, not the right side. And so basically they come back and review. And then whenever they're done reviewing, they can come back and have a better chance at getting all of these right and making the most use out of their last check my work. Okay, does that make sense to everyone in terms of, well, I call this assistance in the learning moment. And why is it important for in the learning moment? Well, because if they submit something and they have to wait 5 days, 3 days, a week to get it back, they're never going to go back and fix, their mistakes. They're never going to understand their mistakes. All they're looking at is their score and saying, oh, I only got 80% on this. I guess I'll have to try harder on the next one. Instead of learning from their mistakes, remember that productive failure concept? We want to make sure that they're learning in that learning moment before it's lost. Okay. So that is a labeling question. And I won't show you all of these because you have access to this and you can take a look at it for yourselves. But I did want to show you, how the student would interact, and why they don't mind doing it. Like when you see my live courses, I have between a 95 and 100% completion of every single homework assignment. And why? Because it's very interactive. You see, it's very kinesthetic on the screen, right? And here's that classification type question where, again, this is a higher order Bloom's where you say, here's specific and non-specific immunity. What makes up non-specific? Oh, I think I remember skin is just like a physical barrier, right? And having this check my work, serves another feature too. What if I'm a student who's a little intimidated because this is my first science class? And I come in here and I say, oh, I think antibodies is, specific because I remember hearing Dr. Fauci talk about antibodies being very specific to that COVID virus, and that now that there's a new strain, some of those, antibodies aren't going to fit and inactivate it. So I think that's specific. But then they might say, let's see how I'm doing here so far. And so now this might serve as a reinforcement. Whenever they get their results back, they say, I am on the right track. And that kind of motivates the student and lets them know, yeah, you know what? You did learn something when you did that reading assignment in Smart Book. It's paying off now. Right? So again, these higher ordered Blooms, asking them to evaluate where all of these different players fit in the process of specific and developing specific immunity versus non-specific immunity. This is a higher ordered Blooms. This would be more of an understanding that includes both Bloom's level 1, memorization, but also the understanding of the roles of each of these structures. Okay. So again, I'm not going to bore you with all of the different types of questions that are in the homework. You'll have access to these to take a look at them, but I think you can see, that they're very, very interactive, and that even I know a lot of you love these. So I'll show you this last one, is the animation-based questions. Okay. And the animation-based questions allow the students to learn visually. So again, we're using kinesthetic, which is the active, learner, where they're going to have to, drag and drop. And then, whenever they come into here, this is a nice animation that is going to allow them to visualize what's going on in that heart while it's showing up as, a graph on, an EKG machine, right? And then they have concepts down here that they have to relate to those different waves or segments, right? Whenever they are answering the questions. So you see that we're incorporating several different types of learning into these question types. So I think I hope that you're able to see, the advantage, to assigning these things and for students to be able to visualize, use auditory learning, kinesthetic learning, all at one time while they're completing their homework. Again, in that productive failure mode where they're allowed to make mistakes and see how they're doing as we grow them. Okay. Any questions about the interactive homework? I want to make sure that I'm not jumping ahead before you have a chance to act. I think they're, fairly straightforward, and you can see how helpful they are in learning moment, providing some feedback and forcing the students to remediate back, to get the information before they're allowed to move forward. So, okay.
Don't see any questions coming up for
All right.
this segment. So,
all right. So now we'll take a look at some of the lab-based activities, right? Because as we said, there's a lecture and there's a lab. And in this new pandemic learning environment, we have to be able to assign lecture content as well as, lab-based content. So we'll go back to that student view. And I think Sarah said that she absolutely loved the virtual labs, and I'll show those first because I think they're sort of that Cadillac version, of the student experience. And
maybe we could just in the chat there, Sarah, in the Q&A, what's one of your favorite labs that you've used so far? Oh, we might have lost her. I don't know.
okay. Well,
Yeah.
I'll
let you continue, Bill. Sorry.
Yeah, if she chimes in, that's fine. Just say, hey,
I'll let you know. Absolutely.
Which one she liked. But what you'll see is just like in a traditional, textbook, you're going to see, there are key concepts that are going to be covered, in this particular activity. There is an overview that allows the student to kind of, say, okay, what we're talking about is the conduction system of the heart. So we have a nice visual here. They can even, enlarge it and take a better look, right? SA node, AV node, bundle branches, Purkinje fibers. Good. Okay, they got that. And then it kind of tells them, a little bit about the setup, for this particular activity. And it tells them what's going to be important, so, they'll see this nice graph and say, well, what does that PR interval or even that PR segment, represent? What's going on inside of the heart during that time? And once again, because you have assigned in the lecture that animation type activity, they should already have an idea of what's going on, right? So, let's say for the ST segment, how long does it take to get all of that blood out of the heart whenever the heart is squeezing? So if it's taking longer, then that means the afterload has been increased, right? And that's where you as the educator can come in after they've done this lab and give them some application of what they've studied. But for right now, they just need to go in and complete the activities. But all of the pieces of information that they need to know prior to starting the lab, meaning the pre-lab, are already here for them to review. But then whenever they come in, you're going to see that like a regular pre-lab activity, we said, okay, we showed you this information, but now we want to see if you actually paid attention. And the good thing is they cannot move on until they've completed this activity, in the lab, which means they can't get credit for the lab. So basically you're requiring them to finish, the lab first, so if we talk about, once again, if they're not moving these, and I did this on purpose, you'll see that it says click on the object to pick it up and then click again to place it. And that click is basically a tap if they're on an iPad or a tablet or a phone. Okay. So if I do that, if I say, okay, where does the P wave go? And I click on it, then I can, just because I clicked on it, now I can move it around, right? And I can drop it anywhere I want. Okay. And then let's say the Q wave, I click on it and now, I can, move that. But what you're noticing is that, the student has the ability to make mistakes, right? But you'll notice that they just can't move on until they get it right. Okay. So that is something that I feel like as a pre-lab or getting ready to conduct this lab, we want them to have some working knowledge instead of just like following a recipe and then you're done, right? We want them to have some understanding as they go through. So I'm going to advance to the next portion and show you that this looks, very much like what they would do in a regular lab. So they have their set of instructions over here, but if they say, well, what are all of these things? I've never been in a lab before. They can click on show labels. And so then now, if they're not familiar with the anatomical position, they see, oh yeah, the left is over here. That's right. And then, the black electrode, red, white. So, they can look at all of that. If they want to see the lab data, this is where they're going to be recording, all of their results, as they go through. And then that's going to produce a nice report for them at the end that if you cover this synchronously, you can ask them questions about the data that they've secured. What does it mean? What does it tell you? What does it represent? And then you can give them some clinical application. Okay. So select the white electrode and place it on the right wrist. Okay. So it says white. So once again, we know that we have to tap, and now I can move it, right? And so we say the right wrist, we tap again, and there it is. It's right where it needs to be. Select the black electrode, click it, right? And place it on the left wrist. And we do. And then the right one on the left ankle. So the red one on the left ankle, we come down and we place it. And now we move on to the next phase, right? So it allows us to move on to the next phase. If we didn't do all of the activities, then we wouldn't be able to move on to the next phase. But you see that it's been very, very planned, thought out. The quality assurance that I mentioned earlier, this has gone out to subject matter experts all over the country to verify that, you know, the steps are in the correct order and that they accurately represent what would normally be done in a lab. And if there were comments, if there were mistakes, if there were things that needed to be changed, that all comes back for a new iteration to be sent out to that committee of reviewers again. So,
Bill, I've got, sorry, Sarah was able to jump in. She said she loves the blood typing lab, and she also likes the tonicity lab. She also had some really nice feedback about the lab as well. She said, I like that students have to go through all of the steps they would have to do if they are in a lab before they were allowed to move on. I also like that they have to enter data observations.
Yes.
It's a very kinesthetic task and much better than just watching a YouTube video or what they would have been doing on campus.
Excellent, Sarah. You are definitely on board. You know what your students need and at what level this content needs to be delivered so that they can grasp the concepts, right? And, students are able to even enter notes, so if you're leading, let's say this lab live and you're waiting for your students to complete certain portions of it and you talk about a clinical application, you can say something like what happens when the QRS complex widens. That means it's taking more time for the impulse to get through, let's say, thicker tissue. So that might lead you to believe that left ventricular hypertrophy is taking place, and they can put left ventricular hypertrophy if QRS complex widens, right? So now they have the ability to go back and then review that after their lab is completed. So what I love about this is that you can utilize it as deeply as you would like to. I mean, it is a standalone. I don't suggest that you use it as a standalone, but it is a standalone lab that can be done by students with some feedback and with gated questions and activities. Means that to get through the gate, they have to complete them to get to the next one. But more importantly, you can lead some of this stuff live and be able to interact with your students just like you would in a regular lab. And that's what I do. Okay, so you see that they now have to apply what they've learned, right? Which the following correctly describes electrode placements. So again, you're checking all of the boxes that if you go through accreditation and they say, what was your lab like? Holy smokes. I mean, if you present this to them and you show them how these activities are gated, they're being asked to, increase their level of understanding and application of the material based on the activities they're required to complete to get full credit, for it, you're going to cover all of your bases. Okay. So,
well, Sarah did chime in here. She said, my students really enjoy when there is a virtual lab because it's different than just answering questions on an assignment.
yes.
She said her teaching tip is she also often pairs the virtual labs with the question and answer assignments.
Yes. That's what we call layered learning, Sarah, in our world. And you're doing it automatically whenever you do that. So, once again, you're putting these two things, side by side so that they can make the connection, right? That's what learning science is all about, is finding better ways to make students, grasp these concepts and be able to apply them. And what you just described is a perfect example of that. Okay. So that is a virtual lab. Okay.
Bill, I also wanted to chime in. We are at 2:15, and I know that you had a few other demos you wanted to walk our audience through. Yep. So I'll leave it up to you, if you wanted to show Phil's or perhaps,
I'll show them the anatomy and physiology revealed, because Phil's
yeah,
a large extent is much like virtual labs, but it's probably it's a little more handheld in the process. So it's sometimes the good thing about Phil's is that it no longer requires Flash. So it's CSS and HTML5. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, all it means is that it has removed the security risk that Flash presented, where people could hack into people's computers. CSS and HTML5 doesn't permit that. So, your students will be much more safe whenever they complete those activities. And that might sound like a little thing, but it's big when it comes to retrofitting all of your legacy content. So if anyone is still using Flash-based, content, that's a no-no, right? So make sure you ask before you use Flash-based content moving forward.
and I'll add too that Phil's specializes and focuses in on physiology labs specifically, and I believe that there's an additional 42 labs available to date. So
there are
just
a ton. And that's why I've included them. And to be quite honest, if you ask for the course that I've created, you will have every single Phil's and every single virtual lab that you can either hide, like that little eyeball that I showed you, or you can reveal it, right? So if you don't want to do the tutorials, or again, if you want the Phil's and you don't want, you'll have several virtual labs, you'll have several Phil's labs. But the one that I think is a game changer, at least for me, was that I've used several different types of anatomy dissection tools. And unfortunately, a couple of things that I didn't like about them. Number one is that it never reported to a grade book. And you might say, oh, well, that's not a big deal, until you have to grade all of those and then record them manually into a class of, let's say, 50, 100, and if you have 2 or 3 sections, that becomes a big deal. So when the students come in and do these labs, everything now is auto-graded, right? And I want to show you from the instructor side first, because I think you will really appreciate what we call competency-based learning and how this new, and I was the lead instructor on this particular project. So I want you to see exactly how it is set up first, and then we'll take a quick test run. And again, I know we only have 13 minutes, and feel free to interject with questions on any and everything. But when you see this lab, you'll notice, number one, that the whole lab is worth 100%. However, I have several different activities in here to mimic what we would consider a real lab. And once again, it's all auto-graded, okay? And it's competency-based, which means that students have to show competence to get through each one of these activities. So one is a traditional dissection, where they have to actually, dissect the heart virtually, let's say, and then they receive credit here for 16. I just divided it up equally. And then they have a 3D model. And the way this one is different is that they have to rotate, they have to open up, they have to go and find it. So let's say if it's the aortic valve, in the typical dissection, if they were to click on it, it would dissect away for the student and they would see it. Whereas here, like a scavenger hunt, they have to go in and find it. And then we have animation, because once again, there's nothing like seeing that visual thing that you can't see a heart beating inside someone's chest. You can't see the blood leaving the left atrium or the right atrium, passing through the tricuspid valve and going into the right ventricle, and seeing that cardiac flow. So, to be able to see that via the animation is really important, but the animations won't let students move on until they've watched the entire animation, which again, board accreditors love to see that. And then we have this quiz, right? We have this animation quiz, which I think, allows us to evaluate, did they learn something from it? And again, each one of these gated. They have to finish this to get to here. They have to finish this to get to here, all the way down. And then what we do for the quizzes is that we say, we need you to, and let me show you that real fast. What we need you to do is we need you to achieve a 90% on this quiz before you receive credit, which means that they can fail it as many times as need be. Very similar to if you were in the lab and you had them with pins and they had to pin all of the structures that you listed on the board. And then whenever you went around, you said, okay, now show me those 10 structures. and then they would have their pins and they would say, I think this is the mitral valve. And you'd be like, nope, that's on the wrong side. That's the tricuspid valve. Try again, right? And so they could go back and practice and practice and practice, but eventually to earn their points, they have to have at least a 90% competency rate to get credit for this lab. Okay. Does that make sense? And again, all of this is auto grading. So you as the instructor never, ever, ever have to, even transport, the grades from, let's say, a spreadsheet in Excel that you would download, and then be able to give to the student. So that activity, let's take a look very quickly at what it looks like, because I did want to show you a couple of little reports that you get with all of the work that your students are doing. So it's not just busy work. So whenever we come into, here we are, here's the heart lab. We come down to the APR activity. And again, I can fast forward through this so that we're not sticking in one section too long like a student would have to. You'll get to see each of these. But when the student accesses this, they're going to have the ability to first dissect. And whenever they dissect, you'll see that they can remove layer after layer after layer. Okay, so we come here and let's say that they want to identify the structures. They can hover, and this is what I would consider almost like an open lab, where if there were pins that you placed for a review for your lab midterm, they would be able to hover and see them, just like if you had pinned them in a open lab. But whenever they click on it, it actually will highlight that structure. Okay, and then if we want to pull or dissect away layers, we can, right? So now we can put in new pins. And again, if we want to dissect away even more of the heart, we can, and put in new pins and hover and say, oh, yep, that's aortic valve. But you say, boy, that doesn't really look like a valve. And then if they click it, it highlights it all. They can even change the color if they don't like that color, right? They say, oh yeah, that purple sticks out better. They can do that. But the important thing is that they have to see and find each of these structures before they're able to move on, okay? And then we have the three-dimensional, which I absolutely love. This is the one where we say, the students can remove, structures, here. So you saw that the blood vessels were really prominent. Now they're just kind of shadowed, or we can take them away altogether, right? And now we just see the heart. And this makes it easier for them to find certain structures. So let's say we went down to the cusps of the aortic valve, right? So if we started with, nothing hidden, you'll see that they can't see it unless we remove things, right? And that we, rotate this heart around. So right now we're on the right side of the heart, so they're not going to see the aortic valve. So what do they have to do? They have to rotate this, right? And they have to manipulate this heart so that they can find that aortic valve, right? So, and again, we can change that, color to make it a little more visual, but you see that the interaction that the student has, with the structures or with the heart itself makes it easier or more difficult for them to identify. See, they had to rotate it up to be able to find, that atrioventricular valve, right? The left one, right? And you can tell it's left because the thickness of the heart is much more. Okay.
So Sarah did have a question that came up. She said, is there a way to set some of these quizzes up as a lab bell ringer format?
What does she mean by a lab bell ringer format? Maybe you can just unmute her if you can, and she can just.
Yeah, actually, let me do that. Sarah, I'll unmute you. Let's see, allow to talk. There she is.
Hi there, guys. Thank you for answering all of my questions.
Absolutely.
I'm just curious. We used to do anatomy bell ringers in the lab as a lab quiz, like a lab test, where we would set up stations and have structures that were pinned, and the students had to go around and answer questions, and they had, say, 2 minutes at a station.
Yes.
So that's what we.
You can set it up that way, Sarah. You can simply assign a quiz. Like you might assign, let's say, the whole lab the way that I've done now, but let's say afterwards, you could just set up the quiz. You don't have to, include all of the other aspects of this lab. You don't have to do the animations. You don't have to do the regular dissection. You could just make it a bell ringer lab for the 3D models, or just the regular model, without the 3D. You can do that. You can just select the quiz, and then you can like here we have the animations, which you wouldn't, but what I want you to see before I go into the quiz is that whenever I hit play, you notice that it brings me back to the very beginning, like I can't scrub to get through it. But when we get to the quiz itself, take quiz, you have several different ways of organizing this quiz, Sarah. You can say click to identify, or you can do lab practical, where they have to actually type in, and spell correctly, the structure. So if it's pectoralis major that you've pinned, and that you want them to identify, then yes, they would have to, enter it like a regular lab practical, type it, write it, and have good spelling, So yes, you can definitely do that. And if you decide to use this tool, you and I, or whoever else wants to join, we can set up another WebEx for just the implementation of Anatomy and Physiology Revealed. Just once again, so that it all auto grades and it takes all of the heavy lifting off of you as the instructor. Okay. So continue to ask questions, but I do want to show you a few reports from the PowerPoint presentation in our last 5 minutes, because I think you're really going to like it. So slideshow, here we go. Play from current slide. There we go. So whenever your students are doing these assignments, especially in the Smart Book, you're going to see at one very quick glance, there's no longer just reports that look like a bunch of spreadsheets, in Excel. Now you'll see that this is highlighted in dark blue. 80% of my students have completed my assignments. That's really good. Okay. And then if I, go to the next one, plus if I were to click on any of these and I want to say, wait a minute, who hasn't completed this? If I clicked on that, orange box, I would see who those 3 people are and I could reach out to them. Okay. The next one is, how long did the students spend, in this assignment? Did what I assigned actually show up? And it looks like students were studying longer, and that's actually good, because this particular assignment was for their exam. So they spent more time than they needed to, just because they wanted to be really prepared. But what really tells me a lot here is that they only spent 66% of their time answering the questions. They spent 34% of their time using the remediation tools, meaning going back to the book to reread, clicking on the tutorial, that an instructor did, to explain a concept, watching a learning animation. So you can see where they were spending their time. And then you have the metacognition, meaning did the student's perception match their reality, like that reading example that I showed you. And you'll see that whenever we see the student who keeps clicking, yes, I know it, yes, I know it, yes, I know it, but getting it wrong, and you see, oh my gosh, only 18% of the time did they say they knew it and got it right. That's terrible, right? That tells you that student's likely to fail. And whenever you call the student in, you basically say, if you're honest with the system, it's going to help you remediate back down and cover those learning outcomes that you need to know before you move on. Okay. And then this one I love, because this is where you as the educator will get a breakdown of all of the learners who struggled with each of these concepts. And whenever you see that half of your class, or even a third of your class, is struggling with one specific concept, oh boy, you need to basically be sure that you cover that. And if you click on it, it's actionable, meaning that it's going to pop up with a learning animation, an educational tutorial, by a subject matter expert, maybe an activity that you can lead live during the first 5, 10, 15 minutes of your class, and make sure that those learning gaps are filled. Okay. And then the last one is the one that I really, really love, especially for things like officers. John comes in and says, I'm struggling in the class. And you say, well, what are you struggling with? And he says, I think everything. And you say, well, no, John, let's just take a look at what you're doing. And if you're doing the things that you should be, and it says here, yes, you completed this assignment with 100%. That's great. You're doing that well. And here you spent 6 hours, right? On this assignment. That's a lot of time, John. So you definitely are committed. And then I see that you're also using the resources that were available to you at 41%, right? You spent 41% of your time going back and looking at other resources. But now you say, well, what can you do better, John? Did you know, John, that down here, these are the subjects or the concepts that you struggled with? And if you click on them, they're going to give you alternative ways of understanding that information. It's going to remediate you. You won't understand remediation, but you say, give you alternative ways of learning that material. And you'll be like, no, I didn't know that. Okay, John, so let's start using that, because it's available to you. And then I noticed here, John, you did not go back and review the stuff that you didn't know. Well, I didn't even know what recharge was, Professor. Well, the recharge is going to help you focus on the stuff that you struggled with in the chapter. And you'll be like, oh, geez, okay, I'm going to start recharging. And then also we look at this and we say, John, 55% of the time you were telling me that you knew the answer when you really didn't. And so that's whenever I ask him, were you just clicking, yes, I know it, yes, I know it, yes, I know it to get through the assignment? And he'll say yes. And if he lies and says no, then you can say that's not true because you never chose a medium or low confidence level, in your understanding of the material. So John, if you go back and you're honest with the program and you say, no, I don't know it. So if you have low confidence down here and I see that you're using that, then the system is going to bring the information back down to something that you know and slowly build you back up. Okay. So I know we're at our time.
You know what? I just wanted to say that Dave said, count me in for a follow-up APR webinar. So maybe that is a good time to sort of pause and just really, I want to thank our audience and Bill for taking time out of everyone's busy schedules and joining us today. I'd also really like to emphasize that, as Bill said all along the way, if you do have questions, if you do want access to any of these gold standard courses for A&P, shoot me a line. My email address is laura.gergley. You can see my last name there in the Zoom meeting at mheducation.com. You'll also receive a follow-up email from me after this webinar with a recording of this event. So just CC me back or email me back and we can hook you up with any other information that you need. Again, gold standard courses, access to review access copies. So at that, I will sort of just end, and I just want to say, again, thank you to Bill, and I hope that everyone has a fantastic end to their winter semester.
And just make
Sarah
sure.
said count me in too for an APR webinar.
Yes, so please.
Noted. Yeah.
Let me know if you want a copy of today's PowerPoint, because there were several things that I actually demonstrated, but were in the PowerPoint that you didn't, get to see from the PowerPoint's, perspective. But it is a very organized way of going through, the content that is available to you. So if you'd like a copy of that PowerPoint or copies of my courses, just to kind of, use. And then also the third thing would be if you want a follow-up, webinar on something like labs. Just let Laura know and we'll get it scheduled. Okay.
Absolutely. Again,
right.
Thank you to all for coming out today. It's been such a great interactive day. Thank you so much for the discussion, and we'll talk to you all very soon.
Okay, great.
Take care.
Take care, everyone.